Ladies and gentlemen, everyone around and in between, it is DebateSensei NPDA edition. This is where we talk about topics that are relevant to competitive parliamentary debate, specifically the National Parliamentary Debate Association. I have my resident expert, Gabe Gravel. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yay, excellent. All right, so our topic this time is Ukraine. Now, I understand that this was the final round topic at NPTE in 2022. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So, but I thought let's start with what might be considered a basic understanding of it, and then maybe get into the upper levels of strategy and sort of debate theory stuff. So, on a really basic level, one way I like starting this is if you were in a round, it was on the Ukraine, and you had to give background on the topic, where would you start? Like, what do you think is an important place to give context about why Ukraine is what it is today?
Well, I think the obvious important background is that there has been an invasion of Ukraine by Russia. At the time that we had this debate, we were only a couple months, I want to say about 2 months from the initial invasion. So everybody's reaction was still a little up in the air in terms of what sort of aid would be given. But for today, the background would be that there has been an extended conflict for more than a year now, that there has been a significant amount of investment from the Russian military into the conflict, in resources and money as well. And that there doesn't seem to be a definitive end to the conflict on the horizon.
Yeah, I'm wondering because, like, at the time, putting in the little annexation by Crimea about almost 10 years ago now, I guess that might come up, but now, like, that doesn't really seem at least necessary in the initial background of it. It could, like, foster a little bit sort of a deeper understanding of the context, but I don't know, going back that far might seem like kind of a waste of time, especially if you have a short amount of time in your first speech.
Well, you might look to that context in explaining why certain parties might do something.
Okay.
Why, like, you might have it as a reason why Russia wouldn't be willing to back down, even if there was more support pouring in for Ukraine.
Right.
You might have it as a reason for the opposite. But that really wouldn't necessarily factor into the top level background stuff. That would be more explaining the decision making of parties involved.
Okay, so always you start with the topic. So let's look at the wording of the topic for the final round. Was United States federal government should significantly increase its military involvement in Ukraine. Okay, are there any potential areas of that resolution that I don't know, cause alarm or extra attention that you would give to it? Is there any vaguenesses or things that you would need to define or outline, in your opinion?
Yeah, 100%. Military involvement is super broad, and it's also bidirectional. It doesn't specify that we are supporting either side. So theoretically, you could read something supporting Ukraine, you could read something supporting Russia, and you could read something supporting both. This is the NPTE, so these are topics that are submitted by students and coaches who write them, and then there's a voting process. I believe that Whitman submitted this topic, and it was absolutely intentional, I believe, the way this is written, to allow for some AF flexibility to be a little tricky.
Oh, so I didn't even think about the idea of siding with Russia on that one. I guess I was just drawn in by the word Ukraine so much that the support would be on that one. But man, you are right. That would be. This was final round, so there was only one debate happening. But oh man, okay.
Well, at the NPTE, because there's so many elims, because it's a double elim tournament, you do debate the same topic multiple times.
Okay. Okay.
So we
Did this?
did debate this topic prior, and we did hit Whitman on this topic.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Did they go pro Russia?
No, they went kind of a middle stance that they said that they would take out the Azov battalion, which is a far right paramilitary group that was siding with Ukraine. They cited a bunch of like terrible things they were doing in the conflict. And the point was they would be able to shield against the common neg ground, which is that Russia escalates the war because the U.S. gets involved, because they would say, hey, you know, we're helping out Russia. Russia wouldn't escalate.
Okay. Okay. So increase its military involvement in Ukraine. Now let's put it into this perspective. Let's say that you are coaching a fairly novice team. Maybe they have some chops when it comes to international relations, but just like they follow the news. All right. So you could speak to that. But what would be your general strategy in that situation if you were going to coach a team like that?
Well, the obvious impact for both sides is that there's a war going on. So the clearest topical advantage would be that somehow U.S. military involvement would stop the war or end the continuation of the war, or prevent some sort of escalation outside of Ukraine from Russia. So I believe our topical strategy, it's probably what we would give a junior or novice team, just because it's directly within the parameters of the topic. And that is that it would end the conflict. We would have specific arguments. I believe our specific AF gave them a particular fighter jet that they would need to defeat Russian air superiority.
Right.
We might not get that specific if we were giving it to novices, but we would say that military involvement would allow Ukraine to win the war definitively, which would avoid the impacts of an extended conventional war, which is bad for a number of reasons, as well as stop the possibility of a broader nuclear war. Because the impact generally in the topic is the war going on, as well as some sort of escalation, it is important to frame your impacts with uniqueness in the correct direction. So we had specific arguments about how Russia was potentially gearing up for broader conflict in the status quo if the war was to continue, that only ending it quickly, which it would have been quickly when we had this topic, no longer would be a quick end to the war now, would avoid that.
So it's generally a deterrent strategy. Right?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So the specifics of the type of hardware, I guess I'll say, the type of resources that we're giving. You have the story about these fighter jets. How important do you think it is to get to that level? Like, if somebody's having trouble remembering that level of detail, is there a way you can, I don't know, simplify, dumb it down a little bit, make it a story? I don't know.
I think at the highest level, because Parley is limited prep, the more specific you can get, the better you're going to do. In stable, like year-long topic formats, or things where you can access back files in round, it's less strategic. But because we get to pick what sort of military involvement we want to give to Ukraine, we can then do a bunch of prior research about why this military involvement is the best, is able to solve the issue more specifically, and we can really get into the weeds on something that we have already decided that we want to do a lot of research on and know a lot about, and catch teams off guard that way.
All right. Let's switch to so a couple of things on the negative, right? Let's pretend that you're on the negative and you don't know what they are running. We could like anticipate them, but what would be your sort of general strategy, the one that you kind of put together that would apply to most, if not all, affirmatives?
So this is a little bit different now that we're
Okay, fair
over
enough.
a year into the conflict. You can still run this argument, but it's, I think, a little bit of a worse argument depending on what the AF does. But especially right around when we had this debate, the main argument was that Russia would escalate the war beyond Ukraine if there were any sort of major moves by the United States or NATO to support Ukraine.
Hmm.
Um, at the time, there was a lot of chatter from Russian politicians uh, saying that any sort of intrusion by Western powers into Ukraine would cause broader escalation. There was some murmurings and talks of post-Ukraine invasion targets by
Hmm.
Russia. And this all sort of framed it as a very dangerous issue for the U.S. to go in and get involved in. Um, it depends based on what the affirmative does, I think, now, the level of or the strength of the link on that argument. But at
Okay.
the time, because the US had not taken any major moves to aid Ukraine, it was, I think, a much stronger argument. Now they offer a lot of like monetary aid, and I believe they do some joint training as well.
Hmm.
Um, which makes it a little more difficult to say that Russia would 100% escalate.
Okay. The politics argument, you just sort of inspired a little spark of an idea, but the politics argument would also be a lot different now than it was then, wouldn't you say?
Like the elections argument or like a
Well,
specific
it could be,
bill?
yeah, it could be elections, but also basically guaranteeing increased military involvement, I think carries with it a heavier political consequences than it did before. Those consequences could affect elections, but it could just affect who the speaker is or what legislation gets put forward too. It's like you don't even have to wait till the elections to trigger impacts.
Yeah, that's true. I do remember. I don't think in this season there was any great politics scenarios. I don't think any
Right.
legislation was super impactful that was like on the docket all year. Um, but definitely now with elections a little bit closer, and maybe potentially because the government's going to shut down. Yeah, those would definitely be better arguments now than they were then.
Right. And just people who aren't familiar with a politics argument, basically saying that I don't know. There's a few ways to do it, but I think the one that applies here is talking about politics being played as a zero sum game, and so wins for some seem like losses for others, and so this will seem like a loss for the Republicans, and then they're going to I don't know what it would trigger. Um, a extra super conservative Speaker of the House, and therefore affect all the legislation thereof.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
have to impact it out. Did you do politics disadvantages in much the same way?
We didn't do it on this topic or anything, but yeah, we
Yeah.
would read politics. I'm fond of the elections disad,
Oh,
uh,
okay.
but you can only read it like once every 4 years. Um, we just didn't really have. There just weren't very many good bills. I think.
Okay.
I sometimes there were, but I always felt that. I mean, it's a generic argument to begin
It
with,
is.
and
It
if we're going
is.
to read a generic argument, we can just read like hedge or econ or something.
All right. Now, on the flip side of deterrence, there's escalation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, how would you outline an escalation? What would the story be? Because you already told the story on the affirmative, and you had some specifics in hardware that you kind of referenced.
Yeah. So the unique scenario would be that Russia is currently at war, but they are not looking to strike the U.S. or strike any NATO targets or expand beyond the borders of Ukraine in this conflict. The When we read it back then, we also had points that the U.S. Had specifically said they would not get involved, especially with like troops on the ground or anything like that. The link would reverse the U.S.'s stance on this issue, which makes the U.S. seem very unpredictable in the international relations stage. It would also scare Russia quite a bit. It would not be good for Russia if the U.S. were to get involved, and it would force Russia's hand to escalate the war further, either by striking targets outside of Ukraine, or by retaliating directly against the United States.
All right. Are any like counter plans popping to mind that would be appropriate for a situation like this?
Yeah, you could read a whole bunch of different like actor counter plans to avoid different backlash scenarios.
Okay.
You could read something like a China actor counter plan, and part of our backlash dissed was that Russia's ideological reasoning for the invasion was like Western and NATO intrusion into that part of Europe. China doing the plan would avoid that ideological motivation, so potentially avoid the dissad and still be able to solve the AF. You could also...
Yeah, it becomes pretty important for you to remember to have that link story be like situated in a way that when you come across your counter plan, you can like recall it and then use it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
To like create that nice through line.
Yeah. Depending on how hard the affirmative would go on I don't really think this would have come up on this topic. You could potentially, based on the AF strategy, read something like ban the plan if they said U.S. Involvement was inevitable and we just had to do it as soon as possible instead of when it's too late. That's not really...
Yeah.
That really doesn't make sense for the AF to do, so I don't think that many negs really thought about that. Really, I think you have the generic sort of counter plans available to you.
Okay. Which ones do you think you would go for off of just a straight up AF?
I think we would probably read a China actor.
Oh, really? Okay.
That's just kind of like what we did a lot, because we just liked to talk about China in rounds.
Okay.
I do think that there is probably room for a pretty tricky, smart counterplan that tries to solve the AF without like physically putting the U.S. military in Ukraine. That might look like some sort of weapon sales, like specific weapon sales, or some sort of like training for Ukrainian troops. That might be smart to avoid the backlash dissad, but we didn't really think of that. We were more focused on just reading two dissads and a counterplan.
Okay.
Round.
Okay. Let's talk about what happened at the 2022 NPTE finals. But first, you said that you hit Whitman on this in a prelim round?
It was an elim round.
It was always an elim round. Okay. Were you AF or neg on that one?
I believe we were neg. Yeah, we were neg.
All right. How'd that go?
It went well for us. They read their Azov battalion argument. They said that they would assassinate. I don't know if they were going to assassinate or they were going to just deploy in this one region where the Azov battalion had control. And that would resolve some of the structural issues that were happening in that area because of the Azov battalion's involvement. We said backlash from Russia and from China. Those were our two arguments. Even though they certainly were trying to preempt the backlash argument by doing something that Russia would maybe see as favorable, we were still able to win the like link level that any U.S. involvement reverses the U.S.'s stance, which makes them untrustworthy. I believe the collapse on the link was that because the U.S. is no longer seen as like trustworthy or reliable on their position in Ukraine, Russia's not going to buy that this is just against the Azov battalion, which means they still retaliate and cause our impacts.
Okay. So like it seems like on the link level, you overcome that and everything seems to fall apart. Like then the story really starts switching. You got to have some pretty good evidence that Russia would like actually understand and process that gesture basically in the right way.
Well, with any policy debate that has similar impact scenarios, what's more important than the link level is the direction of the uniqueness, because that frames the link level, right? So that's why the AF needs to read arguments that are saying that Russia is going to escalate anyway in the status quo. If the AF wins that Russia will escalate anyway in the status quo, then there's no unique disadvantage to intervening now versus not intervening, because the only difference is that Russia escalates, I don't know, a month earlier than they might have anyway, which is why it's also important for negative teams to win their uniqueness scenarios. That's a lesson I think every NPDA debater learns at some point when they face a team reading the same exact impacts, and then they get hosed on uniqueness.
There you go. All right. So final round. Were you in this final round?
Yeah, we were in the final round against UT Tyler. We were also on the neg again.
On the neg again. All right. So let's talk about that one. How did UT Tyler approach this particular topic?
So they had they didn't reject the topic, but they had a critical framing that they had been reading essentially the whole season, and I think the previous season as well. It was based on this German political theorist named Schmidt, who unfortunately was a member of the Nazi Party. Despite this, is a very influential political theorist, and many political theories of sovereignty that are used in like Agamben's writing rely on the description of sovereignty in Schmidt's work. They really liked this argument. They read it quite a bit. They hadn't read it in front of us before this round, but we knew that they read it. And their argument was essentially, so Schmidt's argument is that, all politics is based on like the friend and the enemy distinction. And their argument was that doing the plan would reassert the friend-enemy distinction, and that currently our inaction and Russia's invasion into Ukraine has confused the friend-enemy distinction and therefore collapsed sovereignty, which leads to a bunch of bad impacts. So doing the plan reverses that like political philosophy in general, or the like theoretical reasons behind all this violence happening.
Okay.
Weird argument. They explicitly did not reject the topic, and they defended the material implications of doing the plan, which allowed us to read our disads as if they're just doing the plan, which we were very happy with. We read the same two disads that Russia escalates and that China backlashes against the U.S. if the U.S. does this. And then we had quite a bit of case answers about their usage of Schmidt in the debate round. We knew that they could read this. We had a lot of really good prep about why Schmidt is not only a Nazi, but his political philosophy justifies the politics of the Nazi Party. And then we also had realism answers, because Schmidt is not a offensive realist when it comes to interrogating our relationships with other countries. So we had reasons to deny their theory of international relations based on sort of the like general thesis claims that like offensive realists use, like the international system is anarchy and that security is most important.
Okay. When I was in NPTE, it was still everybody in the audience got a ballot. Is I hear
Wow.
it's different. Yeah, it's different now, huh?
Yeah, it's a 7-person panel.
Okay.
So no, not everybody gets a ballot, but it is a pretty big panel.
Yeah. I got completely wiped out on that last round. It was like I got like 10% of the vote or something like that. So yeah, it's much nicer to get 1 out of 7 than to get 10% of 60 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a panel of 7. Now, how did that affect your strategy at all? I mean, what I mean is, did you know? I'm sure you knew who was going to be on the panel before the round started. That's what I'm asking. Did that affect it?
Yeah, so we always like adapt based on who's on the panel, and when you compete enough, you tend to know all the judges that are in the pool at these big tournaments, and we knew all the judges that were on our panel. The issue though with a big panel that it's much harder to adapt. When you have one judge, it's relatively easy to adapt because you know how they think. When you have 3 judges, it's a little bit harder if one judge has a completely different perspective than the other 2. But even then, you can more easily sort of cater towards the 2 that see things similarly and sort of ignore more the other one. With a 5-person or a 7-person panel, it becomes extremely difficult to adapt perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that we did generally adapt pretty well. We had a pretty diverse on-case and off-case strategy.
Okay.
And the decisions, I think, reflected that. We had like 3 different ways the judges voted, and they kind of were predictable based on what we knew about the judges,
Okay.
even though we were still like just one side.
All right. Okay. Were there any? If you had a different panel, like, how do you think that might change what you'd go for? Are there any arguments that you can think of, any positions, I might say, that would pop up that didn't in the actual round?
I think because our strategy was 2 disads, I think that's like bread and butter for most judges.
Right.
Most like if a judge is like, I don't want to hear the disad, that's a pretty weird judge. You probably wouldn't pref them very high at all. So really, we probably wouldn't have adapted it too much. The only thing I can think of is if we had a more theory-friendly panel, which our panel wasn't unfriendly to theory, but wasn't like great for theory.
Okay.
We probably would have considered reading some sort of violation about garnering like pre-fiat critical framing impacts.
Right.
I don't know that we would have done that because I think everything we said in the LOC was a good argument. So I don't really think we would have adapted very much.
Okay. Very cool. Well, Ukraine is such a complicated topic, and it just gets more complicated, especially with we're recording this right after 1 week after Israel basically exploded on this one. How do you think that relatively nearby yet sort of significant conflict might affect strategy today
in debate rounds?
Yeah.
Well, so we were actually talking about this at practice yesterday because there's a tournament this weekend. I think that it's certainly always a possibility that we have an Israel topic. But the way we have to view it is kind of how we had to view the Ukraine topics when we were debating it right after it happened. And it's what is, the impact? The impact is extension and escalation of like this already existing conflict, right? So AF arguments are generally going to try to stop the broader conflict, while neg arguments are going to argue that they make it worse, they prolong it, and that the conflict is ending now. I think it's very similar in how we had to strategically look at this this historical event when we were prepping this topic. Yeah, the two topics do sort of interrelate as well.
Yeah.
With Russia extremely preoccupied in Ukraine, that changes the likelihood of Russian-backed countries taking specific actions because they don't have 100% access to some of these resources that they might get from Russia.
Right.
But it's very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So Ukraine still very, very high as a likely topic for any debate that you're going to. What's the tournament that's coming up?
We have the Steve Hunt this weekend, and then
Okay.
we're also going to a novice tournament. But the big
All
one.
right. So this is going to be posted after the Steve Hunt, but we'll have some updates on that one very soon after that it happens. Okay. Hey, Gabe, thank you very much for joining me, and I look forward to the next time we get together. All right. All right.